In the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its confidence. Admirals and strategists believed that they possessed the most disciplined sailors, the most daring pilots, and the most fearsome fleet of carriers the world had yet seen. Their doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and above all, surprise. A strike delivered with ruthless swiftness would overwhelm any opponent before defenses could be organized. The Japanese High Command saw themselves as inheritors of an ancient warrior tradition and guardians of a modern industrial empire, ready to crush resistance across the Pacific. For them, victory seemed to hinge not on technology they did not understand, but on spirit, discipline, and initiative. At the time, the Pacific Ocean was an immense stage where vision determined survival. Fleets that could see first had the chance to strike first. Japanese naval intelligence relied heavily on reconnaissance aircraft, fast cruisers, and a network of scouts scattered across island outposts. Pilots were trained to fly long distances over endless seas, returning with observations that would guide admirals in plotting maneuvers. They believed this method was reliable, and their early successes in China and the Pacific reinforced the idea that human eyes, sharpened by discipline, were enough to control the ocean. American naval officers, to the Japanese, seemed clumsy, reliant on sheer industrial output rather than razor-sharp tactical thinking. The Japanese emphasized that a warrior spirit, the Bushido ethos, was their secret weapon. Courage and sacrifice could tilt any battle in their favor. The possibility that an unseen technology, operating silently and invisibly, might change the very nature of detection at sea was not fully appreciated in Tokyo's naval academies. The Pacific, they believed, remained a place where daring pilots and sharp-eyed lookouts defined the outcome of war. The irony was that by the mid-30s, whispers of a strange radio vision device were circulating among scientific communities in Europe and America. Reports from Britain spoke of experiments that could detect aircraft at great distances using invisible waves. In the United States, civilian scientists and military engineers had begun to imagine placing such devices on ships or along coasts. To the Japanese military, however, such rumors seemed abstract, almost fantastical. Their belief in traditional reconnaissance methods remained unshaken. They imagined that even if such machines existed, they would be too bulky, too unreliable, and too impractical for use in the heat of battle. Japanese naval planners crafted elaborate war games in which battleships and carriers maneuvered across paper oceans. These games, often staged with miniature fleets, emphasized surprise strikes against American bases such as Pearl Harbor or island garrisons. Victory always came through stealth, deception, and sudden force. The assumption behind all these exercises was that the enemy would remain blind until it was too late. No chart, no set of orders considered the possibility that American ships might detect an incoming squadron far beyond the horizon, long before any lookout could glimpse a speck in the sky. In Japanese military culture, there was also a certain disdain for over-reliance on machines. Human determination was prized above technical contraptions. This attitude was not unique to Japan. Many navies initially underestimated radar's potential, but in Tokyo, the cultural emphasis on spirit over circuitry created a blind spot. While scientists in America labored quietly to refine radar, Japanese officers doubled down on the belief that courage, endurance, and training would always outweigh gadgets. This confidence was not entirely misplaced in the early years. Japanese aviators shocked the world with their skill in surprise attacks and their ability to outmaneuver heavier opponents. Their Zero fighters, fast and agile, became symbols of aerial superiority. Their carrier operations were precise and devastating, but beneath these triumphs lay an assumption that the battlefield remained essentially visible and predictable. An unseen hand, guiding defenders from miles away, simply did not fit into their world view. Young pilots, standing on flight decks in the late 30s, were trained to trust their own senses. They practiced long-range navigation by the stars and by instinct, believing that mastery of nature and discipline of the mind gave them an edge. The notion that invisible signals might betray their approach seemed almost supernatural, a violation of the natural order of war at sea. To them, the sky was vast and empty, the ocean was endless. So long as they could outfly and outthink their adversaries, victory appeared assured. As the storm of war approached, Japan entered the conflict with this profound sense of superiority. Their faith rested on speed, surprise, and the human element. They did not yet realize that their adversary had begun to master a form of sight beyond human capacity, a method of seeing the invisible, of peering through night and cloud, of unmasking fleets long before they struck. The stage was set for a clash not just of armies, but of world views, one rooted in the traditions of warriors, the other embracing a future where machines extended human perception into realms previously unknown. In the years leading up to the Second World War, a quiet revolution was unfolding in American laboratories, coastal stations, and naval workshops. The story of radar in the United States began not with admirals or generals, but with physicists and engineers who were fascinated by the strange properties of radio waves. As early as the 1920s, researchers had noticed that radio signals could bounce off objects, returning echoes that hinted at the presence of solid matter. To some, it was a curiosity. To others, it was a potential key to solving one of warfare's oldest problems: how to see the enemy before the enemy could see you. By the mid-30s, the U.S. military had grown increasingly aware of the potential. As tensions in Europe and Asia rose, the Navy and Army began to fund secret projects that explored how to transform theory into usable technology. At laboratories like the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., engineers experimented with crude systems that could detect aircraft flying miles away. The devices were large, unstable, and temperamental, yet each breakthrough carried profound implications. Slowly, a new kind of vision was being born, one that did not depend on human eyesight, searchlights, or the unreliable testimony of scouts. The term radar, short for radio detection and ranging, was coined as the technology matured. Its essence was deceptively simple. A transmitter would send out a pulse of radio energy. If that energy struck an object, a ship, a plane, even a storm cloud, it would reflect back toward the source. Sensitive receivers could then measure the time delay and strength of the echo, revealing the presence and distance of the target. What had once seemed invisible suddenly left a signature in the ether, as clear to the trained operator as a light in darkness. The Navy in particular embraced the possibilities. American strategists, aware of the vast distances of the Pacific, understood that traditional lookouts could never cover such space effectively. Eyes tired, weather obscured, and nightfall blinded even the sharpest seamen. Radar promised something different, a tireless watchman, one that could see through darkness and fog. In a region where the enemy could appear from thousands of miles away, this was nothing less than revolutionary. By 1939, experimental sets were being fitted onto select U.S. ships. These early models were cumbersome, with large antennas that required constant calibration, but they offered glimpses of a future where fleets could maneuver with unseen guidance. Coastal installations, meanwhile, were beginning to stretch radar coverage along America's borders, especially as war erupted in Europe. The technology remained classified, spoken of only in code, and confined to restricted rooms filled with humming machinery. Most sailors and soldiers had no idea that such devices even existed. For the officers who did know, radar represented an entirely new dimension of warfare. Naval battles had traditionally depended on line of sight, flares, and chance encounters. Now, commanders could imagine plotting courses based on echoes detected far over the horizon. They could anticipate enemy movements, track incoming bombers, and even direct their own fighters toward unseen targets. The concept was intoxicating, but its potential would remain largely untested until the Pacific erupted into war. It was not only the Navy that pursued radar. The Army Air Corps began to explore how radar could serve as an early warning system against enemy bombers. Towers with rotating antennas were erected, their beams sweeping the skies for distant aircraft. Engineers worked feverishly to refine circuits, reduce noise, and improve range. For every success, there were setbacks, false readings, mechanical breakdowns, and skeptical officers who doubted whether the technology could ever function reliably in combat. Yet progress was steady, driven by a recognition that the future of war would demand new tools of perception. Few outside the circle of insiders grasped the magnitude of what was being created. Politicians spoke vaguely of technological advances, but the details remained cloaked in secrecy. Civilian observers might notice strange towers rising near coasts, but their true purpose was hidden. To the public, the United States remained a nation ill-prepared for war, still recovering from depression. To those behind closed doors, however, radar was a miracle in the making, one that might decide the survival of fleets and cities. The irony was that America's future enemy was not blind to science. Japan had its own physicists, some of whom were aware of international research into radio detection, yet the Japanese military hierarchy was slower to act, reluctant to divert resources from immediate priorities such as aircraft and carriers. They underestimated how quickly the Americans would move from laboratory curiosity to battlefield application. In the shadow of that miscalculation lay a looming disaster for Japanese strategy. By the time Japanese planners were finalizing their designs for a devastating blow against Pearl Harbor, the United States already possessed a handful of radar stations in Hawaii and experimental sets aboard several ships. The technology was fragile and incomplete, but it was real. America had begun to arm itself with a new sense, an invisible extension of sight, that would soon shock the Japanese pilots who believed the Pacific still belonged to the naked eye. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Hawaiian Islands stirred awake under a rising sun. For most Americans stationed at Pearl Harbor, it was just another Sunday morning of routine duties and slow beginnings. But inside a small, scarcely noticed outpost perched on the northern tip of Oahu, two young Army privates were staring at a glowing screen, puzzled by the signals it displayed. Their station housed one of the newly installed radar sets, an experimental tool meant to provide early warning of incoming aircraft. What they saw that morning would later become one of the most haunting what-ifs of the war. The men had switched on the radar just after dawn and quickly detected a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The echo was strong, undeniable, dozens upon dozens of blips stretching across the scope. Startled, they contacted the command center to report what they had found. The response they received was dismissive. A senior officer, unfamiliar with the implications of radar and assuming the reading was nothing more than a flight of incoming American bombers expected from California, told them not to worry. The blip, he said, was nothing unusual. With that, the warning was effectively ignored. Hours later, Japanese aircraft thundered down upon Pearl Harbor in one of the most infamous surprise attacks in history. Battleships burned, airfields erupted in flames, and the United States was hurled into global war. The irony was cruel. America had indeed glimpsed the Japanese fleet before it struck, thanks to radar. But the technology was so new and the human system around it so unprepared that the opportunity slipped through their fingers. The Japanese, meanwhile, had no idea that they had already brushed against the edge of America's invisible shield. This episode underscored both the promise and the limitations of radar in its infancy. The machines could see the invisible, but only if those in command trusted the vision. In December 1941, radar was still treated as a curiosity, an experimental supplement rather than a decisive instrument. Officers trained in traditional methods of reconnaissance could not yet comprehend that a blurry line on a screen might mean life or death. For the Japanese, their strike confirmed their belief that surprise was still possible. They did not yet grasp that the Americans had been only a single decision away from spoiling the attack. In Tokyo, when news of the Pearl Harbor success reached military headquarters, there was jubilation. Admirals and generals congratulated themselves on the flawless execution of surprise. Pilots returned as heroes, boasting that the Americans had been caught utterly blind. The Japanese High Command saw confirmation of their doctrine. Speed, precision, and secrecy had carried the day. Yet beneath their triumph lay a hidden truth, that America possessed tools capable of glimpsing their fleet before it struck, and that those tools would only grow sharper as the war dragged on. The Pearl Harbor radar incident became a lesson for both sides. For the Americans, it revealed that technology alone was not enough. Procedures, training, and belief had to catch up. A machine could provide an early warning, but unless commanders acted, the opportunity was lost. For the Japanese, ignorance of radar's presence reinforced their complacency. They assumed the Americans had indeed been completely blind, never suspecting that a new form of vision had almost undone their perfect surprise. In the weeks that followed, U.S. officers pored over the details of the attack and the ignored radar signal. Anger, regret, and determination spread across the ranks. The failure to act was not forgotten. Slowly, radar began to shift from novelty to necessity. Stations were upgraded, operators were trained more rigorously, and commanders began to realize that the glowing echoes on a screen might prove more reliable than the sharpest lookout on a ship's mast. For the Japanese, the war after Pearl Harbor continued with momentum. Conquests in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies unfolded swiftly. But the seeds of change had already been sown. Radar had been present at Pearl Harbor, and though ignored, it had revealed its potential. The day would come when Japanese pilots would find themselves flying into storms of gunfire from defenders who seemed to know exactly where they were, long before human eyes could possibly see them. That morning on Oahu had been the first glimpse of a new age in warfare, one where surprise would no longer belong solely to the daring and the bold, but to those who mastered the invisible. The months that followed Pearl Harbor carried the Japanese Empire to its greatest territorial reach. Swift victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific seemed to confirm their belief in the supremacy of speed and surprise. Yet, as the war unfolded, the balance began to shift, often in ways that left Japanese pilots and commanders baffled. At battles like Midway and later Guadalcanal, they encountered something that confounded their expectations. American defenders who seemed prepared in advance, as if guided by an unseen hand. That unseen hand was radar, steadily maturing into a decisive weapon. At Midway in June 1942, Japanese carrier forces sailed with confidence, expecting to deliver a crushing blow that would eliminate America's remaining naval power. Their plan hinged, as always, on surprise. But American codebreakers and radar operators were working in tandem, feeding U.S. commanders information that blunted Japanese tactics. Radar stations on Midway Island detected incoming raids early, giving defenders precious minutes to scramble fighters and ready anti-aircraft guns. Japanese pilots, who believed they approached undetected under cover of distance and cloud, were stunned to meet prepared opposition. The battle itself turned into a disaster for Japan, with 4 carriers lost. Though code-breaking played a central role, radar's contribution, alerting defenders before the attackers could strike, was a harbinger of future shocks. Later, at Guadalcanal, the significance of radar became even clearer. The Solomon Islands campaign was a brutal contest of attrition fought in jungle airstrips, on turbulent seas, and under cover of night. Japanese air crews repeatedly launched raids against Henderson Field, expecting to catch American planes on the ground. Instead, radar units on the island routinely spotted them coming. American defenders scrambled their aircraft in time to meet the raids head-on. To Japanese pilots, it seemed uncanny. How could the enemy always be ready? Their carefully timed night approaches, designed to exploit darkness, were foiled again and again. Even more unnerving were the naval engagements. Traditionally, night battles favored the Japanese. Their crews were trained for nocturnal operations, and their ships carried deadly torpedoes designed for surprise strikes under cover of darkness. In earlier clashes, this had given them the edge. But as U.S. warships began to carry radar, the tables turned. American destroyers and cruisers could now track Japanese vessels long before visual contact. In chaotic nighttime melees, radar-directed gunfire struck targets that Japanese officers had not even glimpsed. Suddenly, the cloak of night no longer guaranteed safety. The psychological impact was profound. Pilots who had trained to exploit weather and darkness now faced an enemy who seemed to pierce both. Reports filtered back from the front. American fighters intercepting raids through heavy cloud banks, anti-aircraft fire opening up with uncanny accuracy, surface ships maneuvering with precision in total blackness. To many in the Japanese ranks, it seemed as if the Americans possessed supernatural senses. Few understood the true mechanics of radar, and rumors spread that the enemy had developed strange new ways of detection, perhaps using invisible light or mysterious listening devices. For the Americans, the growing reliance on radar was accompanied by new tactics. Commanders learned how to integrate the data from radar screens into their battle planning. Fighter directors on ships and islands began to vector squadrons with precision, guiding them toward incoming threats invisible to the naked eye. Pilots quickly came to trust the disembodied voices steering them toward enemies hidden beyond clouds or over the horizon. Radar, once doubted, became the beating heart of American defenses. The Japanese response was confusion mixed with disbelief. They still relied primarily on human lookouts, sharp-eyed aviators, and the element of surprise. But their surprises increasingly failed. Bombers were shredded before reaching their targets, and night attacks turned into massacres as radar-equipped American forces intercepted them again and again. What had once been their greatest advantage, stealth, was crumbling in the face of a technology they neither fully understood nor possessed in comparable strength. By the end of 1942, the Japanese High Command could no longer dismiss the evidence. Reports piled up describing encounters where the enemy had clearly detected their forces without visual contact. Yet the full scale of America's radar network remained hidden. To Japanese aviators, it was a mystery. To Japanese officers, an emerging crisis. The battlefield of the Pacific was being transformed, and their doctrine of surprise was becoming obsolete. The invisible eyes of radar were altering the very geometry of war, turning the darkness and the clouds, once Japan's allies, into environments where Americans held the advantage. The transformation of naval warfare in the Pacific reached its most dramatic expression at night. For centuries, darkness had cloaked fleets and concealed movements. The Imperial Japanese Navy, more than any other, embraced the night as its ally. Their doctrine emphasized surprise torpedo attacks under cover of darkness, and their sailors were rigorously trained in nocturnal navigation and gunnery. Throughout the early months of the war, this specialization allowed them to outfight American ships in several night clashes. But by late 1942 and into 1943, a silent revolution was underway. American vessels began to arrive equipped with radar sets that could see through the blackness, turning the night into a killing ground where Japan's advantage dissolved. The waters off Guadalcanal became the proving ground for this shift. At first, Japanese destroyers and cruisers executed daring night raids, slipping close to American positions and launching their deadly long-lance torpedoes with devastating effect. Yet gradually, U.S. warships began to respond differently. Instead of being caught unaware, they maneuvered as if guided by some unseen map. Radar operators below deck traced arcs of light across their scopes, marking the positions of enemy vessels long before lookouts could see them. Commanders issued precise orders based not on flares or searchlights, but on the steady reports of these invisible signals. The effect in battle was stunning. In the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, radar-equipped American ships were able to open fire on Japanese vessels before the Japanese even knew they had been spotted. Guns roared into the night, striking targets that remained invisible to the naked eye. Japanese officers were bewildered, forced to fight blind against an enemy who seemed to possess an otherworldly sense of direction. What once had been their domain, the night sea, was turning against them. For sailors and pilots accustomed to darkness as a shield, the realization was unnerving. Stories circulated of American ships firing accurately without illumination, of destroyers steering directly toward Japanese formations hidden by distance and night. Pilots reported approaching targets only to be met by anti-aircraft fire the moment they drew near, as if their arrival had been anticipated down to the minute. In whispered conversations, some Japanese speculated about sorcery or secret listening devices. Few understood the true power of radar. The Americans, meanwhile, refined the art of radar-directed combat. Special roles emerged aboard ships: radar plotters, fighter directors, and control officers who translated the glowing arcs into actionable commands. The bridge of a U.S. cruiser in a night battle became a hive of activity, with commanders relying less on their own eyes and more on the calm voices relaying bearings and distances from the radar rooms below. With each engagement, their confidence grew. Darkness was no longer an enemy. It had become a partner. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical one. American sailors who once dreaded night encounters began to welcome them, knowing that their technology gave them a decisive edge. Japanese forces, conversely, grew increasingly anxious. What had been a point of pride, their night-fighting skill, now became a source of dread. Officers reported higher stress among crews who feared the unseen reach of radar-guided gunnery. The very environment they had mastered was slipping from their control. The shift also extended to the skies. By 1943, radar-equipped American night fighters were intercepting Japanese bombers under cover of darkness. Ground-based radar stations guided them directly to their targets, allowing them to ambush bombers that believed themselves invisible. The Japanese, relying on outdated methods of navigation and detection, were left confused as squadrons vanished into the night, never to return. Once again, what had been their trusted ally, the concealment of night, now betrayed them. In Tokyo, reports from the front grew increasingly alarming. Admirals and commanders began to acknowledge that the Americans possessed some form of advanced detection that was robbing Japan of one of its most cherished advantages. Yet attempts to counter this technology lagged behind. Japan's industrial base was strained, resources were scarce, and the expertise needed to replicate American radar was limited. As a result, the gap widened, and with each night battle, Japanese forces paid the price. The mastery of radar during nocturnal clashes marked a turning point in the Pacific War. It was not merely a matter of machines, but of perception itself. To the Japanese, the Americans seemed to have stolen the night from them, transforming it into a battlefield where the hunter became the hunted. Each new encounter reinforced the sense that something invisible, something relentless, was watching them. And as the war dragged on, that invisible watcher only grew stronger. By 1943, radar had expanded beyond a defensive tool into a force that reshaped how the United States waged war across the Pacific. What had begun as bulky experimental sets on a handful of ships now evolved into a vast network of eyes stretching across thousands of miles. The Americans had learned to use radar not only to defend against sudden raids, but also to guide their own offensives, reaching deep into waters and skies once considered unknowable. For Japanese forces, it was as if their enemy had acquired a sixth sense, extending vision far beyond the horizon. One of the most transformative applications was in the fight against submarines. Japanese commanders had long relied on stealthy undersea craft to harass American shipping and scout enemy positions, but as radar-equipped patrol planes and escort ships multiplied, submarines found themselves increasingly vulnerable. Radar could detect the faint silhouette of a periscope slicing through the waves or catch a sub as it surfaced to recharge its batteries under cover of night. Aircraft that once would have flown blindly over open ocean were now guided by radar to exact locations, dropping depth charges with deadly accuracy. For Japanese submarine crews, the ocean's vastness no longer promised safety. Equally important was the guidance radar provided to bombers. Long-range missions over the Pacific involved hours of flying across featureless seas, where even slight navigation errors could mean disaster. Radar navigation solved this problem. American bombers fitted with radar could locate islands hidden in cloud or darkness, charting precise courses that brought them to their targets. As the technology matured, radar also enabled blind bombing through overcast skies, allowing attacks even when visibility was near zero. Japanese defenders, who once counted on weather to shield their airfields and convoys, suddenly found that clouds offered no protection. The cumulative effect was that American commanders could coordinate operations with a level of precision the Japanese never anticipated. Fighter directors used radar data to orchestrate aerial battles, vectoring squadrons toward enemy formations beyond visual range. Convoys moved under the watchful guard of escort carriers whose radar detected incoming threats long before they appeared on the horizon. Even amphibious landings, like those at Tarawa and later the Marianas, were guided and shielded by radar networks that knitted together fleets, aircraft, and shore installations into a single web of awareness. For Japanese aviators, the experience was disorienting. Pilots accustomed to striking from nowhere now found themselves intercepted far from their targets. Convoys they thought hidden were met by swarms of American planes seemingly conjured out of thin air. Reports circulated of Japanese formations detected and destroyed before they ever glimpsed their opponents. It seemed that the Americans no longer relied on luck or chance. They simply knew. The radar advantage also reshaped strategy at the highest levels. Admirals who once agonized over the risk of ambush began to plan bold thrusts deep into enemy territory, confident that their radar coverage would reveal threats in time. American ships sailed into contested waters with growing assurance, while Japanese fleets shrank back, increasingly wary of unseen detection. The initiative in the Pacific, once Japan's, shifted inexorably to the United States. Perhaps most striking was the change in perception among ordinary sailors and airmen. Radar became an unseen comrade, a constant companion whose quiet pulses provided reassurance in the darkest hours. Men who might once have felt blind and vulnerable at night now trusted the voices of radar operators guiding them. This trust built morale and reinforced the belief that technology itself was tilting the war in their favor. For the Japanese, the opposite occurred. Confidence eroded as they faced an enemy whose awareness seemed supernatural. Japanese intelligence officers struggled to understand the full extent of what they faced. Reports captured from downed American pilots or intercepted from radio chatter hinted at a vast system of radar guidance. Yet efforts to replicate this system faltered. Their own engineers lacked the resources and time to create reliable equivalents, and the industrial weight of the United States dwarfed their production. By the time Japan grasped the scale of America's radar network, it had already become an unassailable advantage. In effect, radar granted the United States mastery of the unseen spaces of war, the depths where submarines lurked, the skies obscured by storms, the horizons that once hid fleets. The Japanese could still fight bravely, but bravery alone could not overcome an enemy who could see them before they saw him. The Pacific was no longer a vast expanse of uncertainty. Under radar's gaze, it had become a battlefield mapped and monitored with uncanny clarity. By the middle of 1943, Japanese commanders could no longer deny that the Americans had developed a technology that fundamentally altered the nature of the war. Reports from every front told the same story. Raids intercepted in total darkness, bombers shredded before reaching their targets, and surface ships outmaneuvered at night by opponents who seemed to know their exact positions. The truth was dawning on Tokyo. Radar was real, powerful, and devastating. Yet acknowledgement did not guarantee salvation. Japan's attempts to catch up were plagued by delay, scarcity, and confusion. Japanese scientists had not been wholly ignorant of radar's potential. As early as the late 1930s, researchers in Japan experimented with radio detection, and by 1941 they had developed primitive sets capable of detecting aircraft. But unlike the United States or Britain, Japan lacked the industrial base to mass-produce these devices quickly. Worse, the military hierarchy had been slow to prioritize radar, dismissing it as secondary to carriers, aircraft, and submarines. When the war began, radar research was still a backwater, starved of funding and attention. Once the scale of America's radar advantage became undeniable, Japan scrambled to respond. Laboratories worked to refine their prototypes, and small numbers of sets were installed on warships or positioned along coasts. Yet the equipment was crude and often unreliable. Japanese radar lacked the range and resolution of American systems, and frequent breakdowns frustrated operators. Training was another obstacle. Radar required skilled technicians to interpret echoes and guide forces, but Japan could not spare the time or manpower to cultivate such specialists. Many operators were rushed into service with minimal preparation, leading to misinterpretations and wasted opportunities. Field commanders, too, struggled with trust. Accustomed to relying on human lookouts and the instincts of seasoned aviators, they often doubted the strange signals delivered by the new machines. In some cases, radar warnings were ignored or misread, echoing the very mistakes the Americans had made at Pearl Harbor. But while the United States corrected those errors swiftly, Japan lacked both the infrastructure and the confidence to institutionalize radar as the centerpiece of defense. Meanwhile, American radar grew more advanced with each passing month. Sets became smaller, more powerful, and more accurate. They appeared not just on battleships and carriers, but also on destroyers, submarines, and even individual aircraft. The gap widened relentlessly. Japanese engineers tried to bridge it, but shortages of critical materials, such as high-quality vacuum tubes, crippled production. Bombing raids on Japanese industry further hampered efforts, scattering research and destroying precious facilities. Captured examples of American radar shocked Japanese scientists. When they examined downed aircraft or salvaged wreckage, they found components far more sophisticated than their own. It was clear that the enemy had invested vast resources and talent into perfecting the technology. Yet by then, Japan's ability to respond was strangled by dwindling resources, overstretched supply lines, and a war that was already slipping away. The frustration of Japanese aviators was palpable. They flew missions under the assumption of stealth, only to be met by interceptors guided unerringly to their positions. They attempted night strikes, only to be ambushed before reaching their objectives. For a culture that prized surprise and precision, It was humiliating. Pilots began to speak openly of an enemy who fought with eyes in the dark. The mystique of Japanese invincibility, cultivated so carefully in the pre-war years, was eroding in the face of this invisible opponent. In Tokyo, debates raged within the high command. Some argued for a crash program to develop radar and deploy it widely, while others insisted that resources must remain concentrated on aircraft production and defensive fortifications. The compromise that emerged pleased no one. Radar development continued, but at a pace too slow to change the course of the war. By the time modest networks of Japanese radar stations dotted the home islands, the American advance had already swept across the Pacific, tightening its grip. The futility of Japan's radar race became increasingly clear. For every handful of sets they managed to install, the Americans deployed hundreds. For every operator Japan trained, the U.S. trained dozens, supported by standardized procedures and vast logistical networks. The technological contest was hopelessly one-sided. What remained for Japan was to endure, to fight with courage and skill against an enemy who could see them before they even realized they had been spotted. Thus, Japan's attempts to catch up were not only a technical failure, but also a symbolic one. They revealed the deeper weakness of a nation stretched beyond its capacity, wedded to doctrines that had been overtaken by science. Radar was not merely another weapon, it was a revolution in perception. By the time Japan tried to embrace it, the revolution had already passed them by. By the final years of the Pacific War, radar had grown from a secret experiment into an omnipresent force that sealed Japan's fate. What had once been a scattered network of experimental sets now blanketed the American war machine. Carriers launched planes, guided by radar intercept controllers. Destroyers prowled the seas with radar sweeping in all directions, and bomber formations crossed thousands of miles of open water under the steady assurance of radar navigation. For Japan, this meant that no matter how stealthy their approach, no matter how carefully timed their raids, the Americans seemed always to be waiting. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 revealed this gulf with merciless clarity. Japanese commanders assembled what remained of their carrier force in a desperate attempt to halt the American advance. Hundreds of planes were launched, but the Americans intercepted nearly all of them long before they reached their targets. Radar stations aboard U.S. carriers and escort ships detected the Japanese formations from vast distances, vectoring American fighters into position. What followed was a massacre so one-sided it became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many poorly trained by this stage of the war, were slaughtered in waves. Survivors described the horrifying sensation of being met by swarms of American fighters that appeared as if summoned from nowhere. In truth, they had been directed by radar with chilling precision. As the U.S. advanced closer to Japan's home islands, radar's dominance only deepened. Bombers unleashed devastation on Japanese cities by night and day, often through heavy cloud cover. Radar-guided navigation and bombing meant that weather no longer provided safety. Raids that might once have been thwarted by storms arrived unerringly at their targets. Japanese defenders, starved of fuel and aircraft, scrambled desperately but could rarely intercept. When they did, American radar-directed fighters intercepted them swiftly, cutting them down before they could inflict serious damage. Perhaps the most striking demonstration came in the battles surrounding Okinawa in 1945. Japan deployed waves of kamikaze aircraft in a last-ditch attempt to stem the invasion. These suicide planes depended on the element of surprise, diving suddenly from clouds or over the horizon. But the U.S. fleet was girded with radar picket ships, destroyers stationed in advance of the main fleet, their radar screens scanning the skies continuously. Alerts rippled through the fleet, vectoring fighters toward the kamikazes and directing anti-aircraft guns to waiting positions. Though losses were still heavy, Without radar, the devastation would have been far worse. For Japanese pilots, it was another cruel revelation. Even their final weapon of desperation could be blunted by the invisible eyes of the enemy. In Tokyo, officers who survived the war later admitted their astonishment. They described radar as the unseen adversary that had broken their confidence. One naval commander confessed that it was radar, more than America's overwhelming industry, that rendered traditional Japanese tactics useless. Surprise had been their doctrine's cornerstone, and radar had torn it away. Others reflected on their nation's failure to prioritize such technology earlier, lamenting the arrogance that had led them to underestimate the value of machines over spirit. The legacy of radar extended beyond the battlefield. It marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one where information and detection proved as decisive as firepower. The Japanese, stunned by what radar had accomplished, would later study it carefully during the post-war years, integrating its lessons into their own defense planning. For the United States, radar had not only helped win the war, but also shaped the technological trajectory of the coming Cold War, where invisible detection and surveillance would define strategy. Looking back, the astonishment of Japanese officers was understandable. They had entered the conflict believing that courage, training, and surprise would guarantee victory. They left it having witnessed how invisible signals, pulsing silently through the ether, could overturn centuries of naval tradition. Radar had been America's secret weapon of perception, a machine that allowed them to see the invisible. And in the end, it was this vision, relentless, tireless, and inescapable, that ensured Japan could no longer fight in darkness or strike unseen.